In August 2014, I rode my bicycle from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Georgetown, Maryland. The trip took 6.5 days and covered 356 miles, which included a couple of short excursions. My bicycle was a Shirley long-haul trucker with 700 by 35 millimeter tires. This was a self-supported trip, and this picture shows my travel configuration. Pittsburgh to Cumberland, Maryland was on the Great Allegheny Passage, or GAP. I have a video travelogue on YouTube that covers the GAP, so I won't spend as much time on the GAP part of the trip. You can find my GAP travelogue on my YouTube channel, LOVEMYFS, all small letters. Cumberland to Georgetown was on the C&O Canal Towpath. This was the first time for me on the C&O. There is a way to begin at Point State Park in Pittsburgh by riding the Three Rivers Heritage Trail across the Fort Pitt Bridge, but my trip started at the Hot Metal Bridge. This was my view of Pittsburgh from the Hot Metal Bridge as I crossed to the south side of the Monongahela River. South of Pittsburgh, out of McKeesport, the GAP follows the Youghiogheny River. The early morning rain had stopped, and I was on my way to my first campsite. At the end of day 1 and 57 miles, I camped at the River's Edge KOA campground near Connellsville, PA. The campground is right off the trail. They have a small grill where they serve light meals and treats, so I was able to have dinner there and not have to go into Connellsville. The tent sites are grassy, clean, and close to the river. The next day I had breakfast in Connellsville, and I started my next stop in Rockwood, Pennsylvania, about 54 miles away. On my way to Ohiopyle in the morning, I stopped for a short hike off the trail to see this small waterfall that runs into the Youghiogheny River. When I arrived in Rockwood for the evening, I called the Husky Haven campground office and rented the guest house. I knew that the temperature was going down to the 40s that night. I was originally going to stay at the Husky Haven campground right on the trail, but my sleeping bag was only good to the 50s. The guest house is $50 for the first person and $35 for each additional person. The house sleeps up to 7 people. They provide towels, bedding, and coffee. There is a washer and dryer and plenty of showers. That was a good decision because it turned out to be a very cold night. On day 3, my goal was to get to Frostburg, Maryland in time to see the Cumberland to Frostburg Scenic Railway train. After arrival in Frostburg, the engine and its tender are decoupled from the passenger cars, turned around, and coupled to the opposite end of the train of passenger cars for the trip back to Cumberland. The turning is accomplished on a large turntable that rotates the engine almost 180 degrees to a parallel track. The parallel track allows the engine to steam past the passenger cars to the opposite end. And there, it's recoupled to the passenger cars for the trip back to Cumberland. I was able to see most of the maneuver, and I'm happy that I didn't miss it. After lunch in Frostburg, I hurried back to the trail to get ahead of the train. I wanted to get a picture of the train as it steamed past me on the trail. As a bonus, I put my GoPro Hero 3 camera on one of the railroad ties to get a video of the oncoming locomotive. The train doesn't go very fast, and I get a kick out of the guy on the bicycle following the train toward Cumberland. My total distance on day 3 was 46 miles, and about 15 miles of that was downhill into Cumberland. In Cumberland, I stayed at the Fairfield Inn. It's right on the towpath and has a full breakfast. And breakfast is really important to me on these rides. This is looking back toward Cumberland and the trailhead. From here, as we pan across, you can see Wills Creek join the Potomac River at the point where the Potomac curves to the south toward the Chesapeake Bay. As you ride out of Cumberland, you get a good sampling of trail conditions. The Potomac follows the towpath trail all the way to Georgetown, and that's the Potomac on the right. Initially, you see the trail at its best, well-groomed stone dust. On the left, you can see some of the remnants of the C&O Canal. Trail conditions vary widely in terms of trail width and surface conditions. There isn't much of the trail that's quite this narrow. Most of it is a little wider, like this, sometimes with 2 tracks, sometimes with just 1 wide track. I encountered a few mud holes, but they weren't bad. The last rain had been about 3 days ago. I was also fortunate that it didn't rain during my trip. Cyclists who ride this trail during or after a rain are bound to get muddy. Miles and miles of the towpath look just like this. This is very typical. Among the features of the C&O are the hiker-biker campsites. These are spaced about 6 to 8 miles apart along the trail. They have water pumps, picnic tables, and chemical toilets. Many of them are on the banks of the Potomac River. The water is treated with iodine to purify it. I carried my own water, but I did taste the pump water and I thought it was acceptable. On the first day, I went through the Pawpaw Tunnel, which is a little over 3,100 feet long. That's a little over a half a mile. It was completed in 1850 to give the C&O Canal a shortcut through a hill. It's lined with over 6 million bricks. It's long and it gets very dark in there, so as you go through, be sure to have a flashlight ready. On my 4th night, I stayed at the River Run B&B in Hancock, Maryland, 61 miles from Cumberland. It's the yellow building with the white porch. There's a bridge nearby to cross the canal. It was a comfortable place and each room had its own bathroom. I walked to dinner from the B&B and I was also able to get supplies for the next day from nearby stores. Hancock was the only town south of Cumberland that was really adjacent to the canal. In the morning on day 5, I stopped to see the 4 locks. There was a thriving town here into the 20th century. The site has an old mule barn and a lock house. The locks are filled with soil and grass, but you can still get a feeling for what it must have been like 150 years ago. You pass many locks and aqueducts on the C&O. They're sometimes in poor condition and sometimes barely visible. Others have their intact lock houses on the site. In most cases, there is a slight descent of the towpath on the southern side of the lock. The downhill runs at the locks are short, and the elevation change is maybe 15 to 20 feet. The canal and locks are often adjacent to the Potomac River. Here you can see a lock on the left and the wide area of rapids on the Potomac River to the right. Aqueducts carry the C&O Canal over creeks. You can ride through some of them. You ride down into the bottom of the canal, across the aqueduct, and up the opposite side. And again, the drop is about 15 to 20 feet, and the corresponding rise, again, about 15 to 20 feet. In other cases, the only way to cross is to use the towpath. In those cases, there are signs warning you to dismount and walk across, and that's good advice. It's narrow, and it's quite a drop into the aqueduct. Big Slackwater was a surprise to me. I call the towpath there between milepost 84 and 89 the Great Wall of the Potomac. The towpath here was destroyed by a flood in 1996 and rebuilt in years 2010 through 2012. The new wall and trail eliminate a significant detour and was built to survive the flood stages of the Potomac. Historically, this was an area where the canal boats entered the river to take advantage of the slack water created by the dams. The canal builders used this approach to avoid the difficult task of building a canal in the rock cliffs along the Potomac River. This is dam number 4, one of the dams that create the slackwater areas up the river. More importantly, it provided water for the C&O Canal. On the far side, you can see the hydroelectric plant that is still in operation. that was added in the early 1900s and updated in the 1990s. The dam itself is over 150 years old. My day 5 destination was Harper's Ferry, almost 70 miles from Hancock. I made the decision before the trip to camp at the Harper's Ferry KOA. The first thing that I had to do was cross the bridge. I'll show you more about the bridge later. I decided to have dinner before trying to find the campground. I found Hannah's train station at the end of the main street, and I had a delicious pulled pork sandwich. After that, I started the climb up Washington Street. You can see the street rising behind the restaurant. It was about a half a mile at about a 9% grade, and I walked my loaded bike all the way up. My tent campsite at KOA was okay, but it was expensive. They charged $38 and an $8 activity fee. The rationale was that they had a pool, miniature golf, etc., etc. I was there, so I just paid my money. The next morning, I had the free KOA pancake breakfast before heading back downhill to the bridge. So it's about 8:50 in the morning. I'm heading back across the Appalachian Trail walkway to the C&O Canal Trail. And there I'll have to carry my stuff down the stairs. I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, now we go down. I already carried my gear down. It's not really that bad. Somebody helped me carry 2 of the bags down, so I just had 2 trips instead of 3. Let me get this thing. Oh, there we go. Wonderful. Based on what people were telling me on the trail, I was dreading that, but that turned out not to be so bad. Okay, here's my stuff. Stick it back on the bike and I'm gone. Back on the C&O. After leaving Harper's Ferry, I found this maple tree that must have been here for 150 years or more. It was the largest tree that I saw on the trip. This tree probably saw all the stages of the canal from its construction in the early 1800s to its closing in the early 1900s. There are a few old-growth walnut and maple trees along the trail, and you can't miss them because of their size. Later, on day 6, I came to this inlet lock at dam number 2. You can see where the water from the Potomac was diverted by the dam to the inlet lock. The purpose of the inlet lock was to control the flow of water into the canal. It also provided a way for boats to enter and exit the slackwater areas in the river. This was a short day, and I arrived at Swings Lock, Lock 21, after riding 48 miles. There are chemical toilets there, but no water pump. There are 5 overnight campsites, and I got the last one. After I pitched my tent, I rode my bicycle into nearby Potomac to have dinner and buy supplies for breakfast the next morning. The campsites were crude but acceptable. There was a nice view of the river at dusk. I noticed that the squirrels were foraging, and I put all my stuff under my tent rainfly for the night to keep it safe from them. Day 7, the last day of my trip, was very short. I rode 19 miles from Swings Lock to Georgetown. The most interesting feature that morning was Great Falls, where the Potomac rushes through Mather Gorge. A striking thing about the Potomac is that it has so many different personalities, from the little river out of Cumberland to the wide, slow, slack water areas behind the dams, the rapids, and these falls near Georgetown. As I approached Georgetown, I was surprised to find that even at mile 9 as I passed Lock 11, the trail still felt remote. I expected to see a little more urban environment at this point of the trip. I did find that the trail became much rougher near the end, with a bed that had large bumpy stones embedded in the stone dust. This was for maybe the last 10 miles or so. It was only during the last mile that I began to see signs of the city when I rode along the street for a while. By the way, don't be tempted to take the neighboring Capitol Crescent Trail in this area. It's paved, but it diverges from the C&O, and it's difficult to get back to the C&O. I tried that, and I had to climb some stairs to get back onto the C&O. I missed this bridge where the towpath crosses to the opposite side of the canal. It didn't take me long to realize that I missed something when I found myself riding on the street. On the other side, the trail is very narrow. And this is what it looked like about a half a mile away from the end of the trail. This was the end of the towpath in Georgetown. Reaching the end for me was a sad event. It had been a great ride and adventure. Everything went well, and I had no flat tires and no mechanical problems. I met some interesting people and saw things that couldn't be seen from a tour bus or a car. The entire route from Pittsburgh to Georgetown may be unique in the country because of its length and because it is a dedicated trail. This is a ride that I highly recommend.